She always seemed to have it all together. Her photos radiated a certain effortless charm. The sunlit streets of Paris, the golden cliffs of Santorini, the tranquil beaches of Bali. Every image she posted on Instagram was like a perfectly wrapped gift, a glimpse into a life most people could only dream of. Her captions were light, breezy, full of wanderlust and cheer. Caught the sunrise again. Weekend getaway vibes. Chasing dreams and sunsets. Her followers adored her, showering her with likes, comments, and envy. On the surface, it seemed she had built the perfect online fairy tale. But what I saw, what no one else seemed to notice, was something that didn't fit. There was a shadow. It appeared in every photo she posted, sometimes faint, sometimes pronounced, but always there. And it wasn't hers. Nor was it her husband's. Mark, her husband, was tall, broad-shouldered, a man whose silhouette was as recognizable as his laugh. If he had been there, you'd know. You'd see his signature stance or that unmistakable grin. But the shadow in her photos didn't belong to Mark, and the more I looked, the more I couldn't ignore it. The first time I noticed it, I brushed it off. Shadows are tricky things. They can stretch and distort in strange ways, and in certain lighting, anything can look eerie. It was in a picture of her at a vineyard, a golden glass of wine in her hand as the sun dipped below the horizon. She was alone, leaning against a wooden fence, the rows of grapevines stretching out behind her. In the background, though, there was a faint outline of something, a tall, human-like shadow just beyond the rows. I figured it was just her timer catching someone passing by. But then it happened again. And again. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it. Maybe I was looking too hard. Maybe it was just another tourist, or a local, or someone who happened to be walking by at the exact moment her timer went off. But the more I scrolled through her feed, the more it stood out. The shadow was always there, always close, and never the same shape twice. It didn't feel accidental. It felt deliberate. I began to go back further, combing through all the photos I'd liked months ago without a second thought. Her picture-perfect hikes in the Rockies. Her city strolls in Rome. Her quiet mornings on an empty beach. And every time, somewhere in the frame, was the shadow. Not enough to draw attention from casual viewers, not enough to cause a stir in her comment section, but enough that once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. I found myself staring at the photos longer than I wanted to admit. There she was, as radiant as ever, smiling for the camera, the warm light hitting her just right. But there it was, too, looming, watching, always just a step behind. It made my skin crawl. If it wasn't Mark, then who was it? And if it wasn't a person, then what was it? I felt silly for even thinking that, for letting my mind run wild, but the unease stayed with me. I debated saying something. What would I even say? Hey, noticed a creepy shadow in your photos. Everything okay? I could already hear her laughter, the light-hearted brush-off. Oh, it's nothing. Just the wind, the trees, the lighting. I didn't want to seem paranoid. I didn't want her to think I was searching for trouble where there wasn't any. But I also couldn't ignore the pattern. She was too meticulous, too careful with her posts. Every shot, every filter, every caption was chosen with intention. If anyone was going to notice something odd, it would be me. After all, I knew her better than most. We'd been friends for years, long before the polished influencer persona took shape. I remembered the way she used to be, back when her photos were just snapshots from a regular life. Back then, she shared pictures of late-night coffee runs, cluttered desks, and silly faces. I'd watched her Instagram evolve into something polished, something curated, something less real. Over time, her posts became more professional, more detached. It was like watching a friend disappear behind a glossy, filtered version of herself. And now, this shadow felt like a crack in the facade. A reminder that maybe not everything was as perfect as it seemed. I couldn't stop wondering. Did she see it? Did she know it was there? If she did, why wouldn't she mention it? Why keep posting photos where it was so clearly visible? Unless, she couldn't see it. Unless, to her, it wasn't there at all. That thought kept me up at night. I stared at the images again and again, my brain piecing together fragments of memories, trying to make sense of something that didn't belong. I thought about all the times we'd talked, all the things she'd shared. She had always been honest, open. But lately, there had been a distance in her voice, a vagueness in her answers. And now, there was a shadow in her pictures that didn't match her life. I knew I couldn't let it go. I had to understand what I was seeing. But every time I tried to put it into words, I came up blank. How do you explain to someone that their photos feel wrong? How do you tell someone that their perfect life on Instagram looks like it's being followed by something they can't see? I was still staring at her latest post, another sunset, another stunning landscape, another shadow, when my phone buzzed. A new picture. A new location. A new shadow, just behind her. It took me a while to work up the nerve to say something. I'd written half a dozen messages, all variations of the same question: "Hey, have you noticed that shadow in your pictures?" Each time, I'd delete it before hitting send. It sounded ridiculous. How do you ask someone about a shadow without coming across like a paranoid conspiracy theorist? How do you tell someone their life, so carefully constructed, so enviably perfect, has an undercurrent of something dark and unspoken? I decided to let it go. At least, I tried. But the more I scrolled through her profile, the more unsettled I became. The shadows weren't just random. They seemed to follow her. In one photo, it stretched long and distorted along the cobblestones of a small European street. In another, it loomed large against the side of a cliff as she posed, smiling, near the edge. The angle was wrong, the light too soft for a shadow that harsh. It didn't make sense. I began to wonder if she knew. Maybe she was ignoring it. Maybe she didn't care. But that didn't seem right. She was meticulous about her photos, about her image. If she noticed the shadow, surely she would have cropped it out or mentioned it as a joke. But there was no mention of it. Not in the captions, not in the comments, nowhere. What unsettled me the most wasn't just the presence of the shadow, it was how close it was to her. It wasn't some distant figure blending into the background. It was always there, hovering just behind her, as if it was meant to be part of the shot. As if it belonged there in a way that Mark, the man she used to feature so proudly, no longer did. I thought back to the last time I'd seen her in person. It had been months ago, before her Instagram took on this polished, professional glow. She'd been different then, more relaxed, more open. Back then, she would have laughed if I'd pointed out a strange shadow in her pictures. She'd have made some goofy joke, maybe posted a follow-up selfie calling it her mystery travel buddy. But now? Now her posts felt distant, like she was keeping something to herself. I decided to pay closer attention. If I couldn't ask her outright, I'd watch for more clues. I started checking her Instagram stories. Unlike her posts, which were perfectly curated and filtered, her stories were more off the cuff, quick videos of her walking through city squares, snapping a sunrise, showing off the local food. But even in those fleeting moments, the shadow appeared. A split-second reflection in a cafe window. A dark figure caught in the corner of a frame. It was never clear enough to be identified, but it was always there. Always present. One story, in particular, sent a chill down my spine. She was filming herself walking along a winding trail in the woods. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. She was talking about the fresh air, how nice it was to be somewhere so quiet and peaceful. The camera tilted slightly, giving a brief glimpse behind her. And there it was, a shadow, darker than the rest, moving with her. It wasn't hers. It couldn't have been hers. I replayed that story over and over, trying to catch more detail. But she moved the camera too quickly, and the moment was gone. Still, the image burned into my mind. She wasn't alone. Even if she thought she was, something, or someone, was following her. I couldn't help but wonder why no one else had said anything. She had thousands of followers, dozens of comments on every post. Surely someone else must have noticed by now. Or maybe they had, but they dismissed it. Maybe it was easier to assume it was just a trick of the light, a quirk of the camera. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. I started looking at her older photos again, this time from before she met Mark. Back then, her posts were simpler, group shots with friends, pictures from family holidays, goofy selfies at home. There were no shadows in those pictures. No strange, dark shapes lurking in the background. It was only after she and Mark got together, only after their whirlwind romance and storybook wedding, that the shadows began to appear. Mark used to be in every post. He was always by her side, laughing, holding her close, making her smile. But now, he was nowhere to be seen. It had been months since she'd shared a picture of the two of them together. She still wore her wedding ring in some photos, but in others, it was conspicuously absent. Her captions never mentioned him anymore. What had changed? And why did the shadow start appearing after he disappeared from her feed? I tried to reason it out. Maybe they had grown apart. Maybe Mark was busy with work. Maybe she was traveling solo more often, and the shadow was just another tourist who happened to be nearby. But none of that explained why it was always the same shadow, always the same distance away, always lurking just out of reach. One night, as I lay awake scrolling through her posts yet again, I found myself wondering if I should call her. Not text. Not message. Actually call. I wanted to hear her voice, to ask her how she was doing, to find out if there was more going on than what she was showing online. But every time I picked up the phone, I hesitated. What if she thought I was crazy? What if she laughed it off and I ended up feeling foolish? And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to be the nosy friend, the one who pried into her personal life, but I couldn't just ignore what I was seeing. I kept thinking about that shadow in the woods. The way it moved with her, the way it stayed just far enough behind that she never seemed to notice. It wasn't just a random passerby. It wasn't just a trick of the light. There was something deliberate about it, something intentional. I knew I couldn't let it go. Not yet. I woke up the next morning with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The shadow had followed me into my dreams, looming just behind her in that endless carousel of Instagram perfect moments. It was like my subconscious had taken all those photos I'd scrolled through and mashed them together into one long, dark montage. I felt exhausted, drained, as if I'd been running from something all night. I poured myself a cup of coffee and tried to focus on the day ahead, but my mind kept wandering back to her feed. I knew it was ridiculous. What was I going to do, spend another day obsessively analyzing her photos? Still, as I sat there staring at my laptop screen, I couldn't stop myself from opening Instagram again. Her page was quiet. No new posts, no new stories. Just the same grid of flawless images, each one now etched in my memory. The shadow haunted me more than I cared to admit. I thought about calling her again. This time, I was determined to actually follow through. If she thought I was being ridiculous, so be it. I just needed to hear her voice, to know she was okay. I opened my phone's contacts and hovered over her name. Just as I was about to tap it, a new notification popped up on Instagram, @Amanda Forever added a new photo. My thumb hesitated, then tapped the notification almost involuntarily. The picture loaded slowly, my Wi-Fi was being annoyingly sluggish. When it finally appeared, I felt my heart skip a beat. It was different from her usual posts. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't posing in front of a landmark or lounging on a beach. She was sitting at a small table, her hands folded, her expression blank. Her face was turned slightly away from the camera, as if she hadn't meant for the photo to be taken. The lighting was dim, casting long, heavy shadows across the room. And there it was again. The shadow. This time, it was sharper, more defined, leaning slightly closer to her as if it were about to speak. It didn't make sense. There was no one in the frame who could have cast it. The shape was human, but it was all wrong, too angular, too stretched. It was like something from a bad dream. Her caption was simple, taking a break. Thanks for your support, everyone. I scrolled down to the comments. They were pouring in, people telling her to take care of herself, sending hearts and supportive messages. You deserve a rest. We'll be here when you're ready. Take all the time you need. It was clear they thought she was just feeling burnt out. But I couldn't ignore the shadow. None of them mentioned it. None of them saw what I saw. It was right there, plain as day, and yet I felt like I was the only one who could see it. I clicked back through her profile, scrolling through the older photos again, but now my eyes lingered on the captions. I hadn't paid much attention to them before. They were always generic, another beautiful day, or loving this view. But now I was searching for something, some clue I might have missed. I realized her captions had changed over time, becoming more vague, less personal. Instead of describing the place or the moment, they became placeholders, sentences that seemed to say nothing at all. I wondered if she was running out of things to say, or if she was deliberately hiding something. I flipped back to the new photo. Her eyes looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping. Was she okay? I tried to remember the last time we'd actually spoken. It had been months, maybe even a year. Back then, she'd been so vibrant, so full of energy. She'd tell me about her adventures, her plans with Mark, her next big trip. But in this photo, that spark was gone. I didn't know if it was because of the shadow or something else entirely, but it was clear she wasn't the same person. I tapped out a comment. You okay, Amanda? If you need someone to talk to, I'm here. I stared at the words, then deleted them. I couldn't bring myself to post it. Something held me back, a nagging voice in my head that told me it wasn't the right time. Instead, I closed the app and tried to focus on something else. Work, chores, anything to take my mind off that photo. But all day, I kept thinking about her sitting there, that shadow stretching toward her like it was about to pull her into the darkness. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt my phone buzz. It was a message from her. "Hey, haven't heard from you in a while. Hope you're doing okay." Her words caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on her photos, so caught up in the shadow, that I hadn't thought about how she might be feeling. Maybe she was reaching out because she sensed I'd noticed something. Or maybe she just wanted to reconnect. Either way, it was the opening I needed. I replied quickly. "Hey, Amanda. I'm good. How are you?" Her response came almost instantly. "I'm fine. Just needed some time away. Things have been a bit much lately." A bit much. I stared at her words, reading between the lines. She wasn't telling me everything. I felt a sudden urgency to push further, to ask about the shadow, about the changes I'd noticed in her pictures. But I stopped myself. If she was ready to talk, she would tell me. I didn't want to scare her off. Instead, I typed, "I understand. If you ever need to talk, I'm here." "Thanks," she replied, and that was the end of the conversation. I put the phone down, feeling no closer to answers than before. But now, I knew I had to keep watching. I had to figure out what was really going on. Over the next few days, Amanda went quiet. No new photos, no stories, nothing. Just silence. It felt strange. She had never been one to disappear from social media for long. She thrived on her followers' engagement, on their admiration of her seemingly flawless life. But now, it was as if she'd vanished. I tried not to read too much into it. Maybe she was genuinely taking a break. Maybe she was just tired. But I couldn't stop wondering. Was she okay? Had something happened? The shadow in her last post haunted me more than I cared to admit. I kept seeing it in my mind, that dark shape leaning toward her, closer than ever. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. On the fourth day of her silence, I decided to check in on her. I pulled up her Instagram, scrolling back through her old photos, hoping to find some clue I had missed. The images were the same as always, bright, beautiful, carefully curated. But now, they felt different. Now, every smile seemed forced, every caption felt hollow. And the shadow, it was always there, always just out of reach, as if it were part of the background she didn't realize she was capturing. I sent her a text. "Hey, just wanted to check in. Haven't seen you post in a while. Everything okay?" An hour passed with no response. Then two. By the time the sun set, I still hadn't heard back. I tried not to let it bother me. She was probably busy, I told myself. Maybe she just needed some space. But as the hours stretched into the next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When my phone finally buzzed with her reply, I felt a wave of relief, until I read it. "I'm fine. Just taking some time to myself. Thanks for checking in." Her words felt cold, distant. Not at all like the Amanda I knew. She was usually warm, chatty, full of life. But this message was clipped, as if she didn't want to say more than absolutely necessary. I stared at it, debating how to respond. Should I push? Should I ask why she sounded so distant? But no matter how I phrased it in my mind, it felt wrong. I didn't want to come across as paranoid. Instead, I simply replied, "Okay. Let me know if you need anything." I didn't hear back. A few more days passed, and still no new posts. Her silence began to feel suffocating, as if the absence of her photos was more unnerving than the shadowed images had ever been. I kept checking her profile, hoping for some sign she was still there, still herself. But every time I opened her page, it was the same. No updates, no new stories, just that final image of her sitting at the table, her face turned away, the shadow looming behind her. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to call her. I hesitated for a moment before pressing the button, worried she wouldn't pick up. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then her voice came on the line. "Hello? Hey, it's me," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "I just wanted to check in. You've been pretty quiet lately." She paused, and for a moment I thought she might hang up. But then she sighed. "Yeah, sorry. I've just been dealing with some stuff." "What kind of stuff?" I asked gently. "You know you can talk to me." Another long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more hesitant. "It's nothing, really. Just work stress. Life stuff. You know how it is." I didn't know how to respond. Her words felt carefully chosen, like she was trying to keep me at arm's length. But I could hear something beneath the surface, something she wasn't saying. She sounded tired, almost defeated. "Well, if you ever need to vent, I'm here," I said, my voice light but sincere. "I just want to make sure you're okay." "Thanks," she replied, and then there was silence again. I waited for her to say more, but she didn't. "Okay," I said finally. "Take care, Amanda." "You too," she murmured, and the line went dead. I set my phone down, staring at it for a long time. The conversation had only deepened my unease. She was hiding something, of that I was certain. But I didn't know what, or why. All I knew was that the vibrant, confident woman I'd known for years was slipping away, retreating into a shadow of herself. And the shadow that followed her in every photo seemed closer than ever. The next time I saw her online, it was almost a week later. My feed refreshed, and there she was again. Another photo. Another caption. Another place I'd never seen her mention before. She was standing by a river this time, the water rushing past behind her. She had that same practiced smile, but it looked tighter now, strained. Her posture was stiff, her head tilted at an awkward angle, as if she wasn't sure whether to look at the camera or beyond it. And there, as always, was the shadow. I stared at the screen, my fingers frozen above the screen, unsure of what to do. The shadow wasn't just faint this time. It was stark, darker than ever, and unmistakably close. It stretched over the rocks beside the river, the edges sharper, clearer. It wasn't a trick of light. It wasn't someone in the distance. It was right there, just a step away from her. Her caption didn't mention it. In fact, it barely mentioned anything. Another quiet spot to think. Solitude, that was it. No explanation, no context. Just that. She turned off comments on this one. She never did that. But now there was no way for anyone to say anything, not that anyone ever did. It seemed I was the only one who ever noticed the shadow. I was the only one who cared. I stared at the photo until the edges blurred, until my mind started piecing together every other image she'd posted. It wasn't just a shadow. It was more than that. It was closer. And it was watching. I couldn't stop myself. I clicked through every image again, flipping back months, years. It had always been there, hadn't it? Just out of reach, just at the edges of her life, never fully formed, but always present. Now, though, it wasn't at the edges anymore. It was beside her. With her. I felt a chill run through me. It was late, the room was quiet, and the glow of my phone was the only light. Every logical part of my brain screamed at me to stop, to put it down, to walk away. But I couldn't. I kept scrolling, clicking, zooming in on every shot, searching for any clue that would make sense of what I was seeing. Then I reached the last photo. The one from that table, the one where she wasn't smiling, where her face was turned away. I hadn't looked at it closely before. But now, with all the others fresh in my mind, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The shadow wasn't just behind her. It wasn't just looming over her shoulder. It was touching her. Its edge, sharp, inky, seemed to blend into her outline, as if it had wrapped around her arm. My stomach twisted, and I felt the hairs on my neck rise. I closed the app, set my phone down, and stared at the wall. My thoughts raced, tumbling over each other in a chaotic loop. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something I could just ignore. I thought back to our last conversation, the way her voice had sounded. Tired. Hesitant. Almost as if she was afraid. Afraid of what, though? What was she dealing with that she couldn't, or wouldn't, share? The shadow wasn't just a photo anomaly. It was something real. Something that had been following her for months, years. And she had never once acknowledged it. Not to me. Not to anyone. I wanted to call her again. To ask her what was really going on. But the thought of doing so made my chest tighten. What if she didn't answer? What if she did and refused to tell me? Or worse, what if she told me the truth, something I wasn't ready to hear? I stared at my phone again, at the last message she'd sent. I tried to think of what to say. How do you ask someone about a shadow that shouldn't exist? How do you explain that you've noticed something that no one else sees? Every possible message I thought of sounded insane. Every word I typed felt like I was crossing a line I couldn't come back from. But I couldn't just sit here. I had to do something. I opened a blank message and started typing. Amanda, I need to ask you something. It's about your photos. I've noticed. Before I could finish, my phone buzzed. A message from her. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it. I've been meaning to tell you. I just didn't know how. My hands froze over the keyboard. My pulse quickened. She knew. She knew I'd seen it. Before I could reply, another message came through. It's not what you think. I stared at her words, my mind racing. What did she mean by that? What wasn't what I thought? The shadow? The reason behind it? I tried to respond, but before I could type, another message appeared. Please don't say anything. I read it again, over and over. Please don't say anything. About what? To who? My thumbs hovered over the keyboard, my thoughts spinning in a dozen directions at once. I typed a single word, why? This time, her reply didn't come right away. I waited, my phone resting on my knee, my breathing shallow. Minutes ticked by. The room felt too quiet. When my phone finally buzzed again, the message was short. It's just complicated. I'll explain soon. I stared at the screen, a million questions flooding my mind. But there was no answer, not yet. Only silence. And that shadow.